recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tuggeranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous people. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about the land in which you are working or joining us from today, please head over to native-land.ca to learn about the territories, languages, and treaties of your region. And without anything else from me, I would like to welcome Rachel and Victoria to join us in a discussion on Canada's first national pollinator strategy. Rachel is a postdoctoral visitor in the Native Pollinator Research Lab in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. And Victoria is a research associate with a new PhD in the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change at York University as well. So please welcome both of you. I will turn it over to you now.
Thanks. Thanks, Carolyn. Before I share my screen, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, you sound great, Rachel.
Fantastic. Okay, let me get my screen share up here. All right. All right, so can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to be looking down at my notes here, so I don't know if you can still see me too, so that might be a bit distracting, but I'll try to stay in frame as much as possible. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction, Carolyn, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm excited to be sharing with the group more about this project we've been working on, involving recommendations for a national strategy centered on wild pollinator conservation. So this project was initiated by Dr. Sheila Colla's lab here at York. It's supported by the Weston Family Foundation. It will be wrapping up late spring, early summertime next year, so it's still a work in progress. And my hopes for this session is that we can get a good discussion going. This is such a big topic, and because all of you have expertise and experience in different areas and are engaging with solutions from your own unique professional vantage point, I see this as a real opportunity to build a richer context around some of these recommendations or solutions that I'll be discussing. All right, a quick talk overview. I'm going to discuss the rationale and the scope for the project. And then the next step, we'll look at a few other national pollinator plans and see if there are any lessons there for us. We'll talk about our approach in crafting the strategy recommendations, and then we'll get into the specific expert-generated solutions that came out of that approach to provide a bit more context around them as time permits. And then we'll talk about the next steps of the project. So as you all know, tackling wild pollinator declines is a really complex topic. We have multiple stressors that interact in ways that we're only beginning to understand, and addressing these stressors requires engagement from almost every sector of Canadian society. So from the beginning of this project, it was important to settle on the scope in terms of the audience and at what level we wanted to plug into the issue, so to speak. Decision makers are stretched, so we wanted to provide something that was relatively succinct without sacrificing the integrity of the content. We wanted to provide clear action steps grounded in science, but to provide a rationale and context for the recommendations that any non-scientist could grasp. So in terms of the scope, like any other large-scale biodiversity conservation effort, wild pollinator conservation requires horizontal integration, effort across levels of governmental departments, agencies, industries, civil society, and the like. And success also depends on a healthy mix of top-down policymaking as well as grassroots initiatives, so vertical integration. And all of you are plugged into this effort at one level or another, or multiple levels. So when we're talking about bottom-up policymaking, there are a lot of municipalities that have pollinator plans. They're committed to bee city programs, or other programs have started as, or been inspired by grassroots initiatives. And even if they may be taking some steps that won't best benefit pollinator biodiversity overall in the long term, like planning for only 1 or 2 species, for example, the effort and interest, I would say, is definitely there. Provincial action has been fairly anemic. We've had Ontario take a couple steps in the right direction with the pollinator health strategy and action plan. And then they low-key canceled it in 2018, less than 2 years after it took effect, without public input as required under Ontario's Environmental Bill of Rights. What we honed in on was the real vacuum in leadership at the level of the federal government as an important motivator and coordinator of provincial action. So why do we need a strategy? And this might be obvious to an audience who already deeply cares about pollinators, but a more detailed rationale that we provide decision makers is that the federal government is the outward face of Canadians striving to fulfill our Aichi biodiversity targets, and is also the guarantor of monitoring efforts to measure progress toward those targets. The issuance of a national pollinator strategy also provides orientation around a unified vision and a series of shared goals via some national plans. And we really face some unique challenges for enacting robust biodiversity conservation efforts, given the Canadian Federation's anomalous degree of decentralized authority over natural assets and resources. In a recent paper examining the failures and challenges of tackling the Canadian biodiversity crisis, authors Justina Ray, Jamie Grimm, and Andrea Olive highlight this unusual degree of decentralization as a complicating factor to solving the crisis within federal and subnational policy frameworks. They call for bold federal leadership and coordination that overcomes jurisdictional fragmentation, and that's really what we're advocating for here. The federal government can operationalize success in relationship to wild pollinator conservation by setting goals with targets and shepherd the development of flexible yet standardized subnational plans where provinces and territories would work to achieve these goals. Subnational plans under the umbrella of a national strategy also creates a system of accountability and contains expectations on how progress should be reported up. The adoption of a national strategy also recognizes the role of the federal government in allocating funds and establishing programmatic requirements for joint federal provincial initiatives and research. And the Canadian public have also shown an intense interest in protecting pollinators, and research has demonstrated, research actually coming out of Dr. Colla's lab, that the majority of Canadians think that the government should take the lead. And lastly, the Canadian government plays a crucial part in mobilizing knowledge regarding issues of pollinator health, research, and conservation. So one of the advantages of being long overdue in issuing a strategy is you can look and see what's already been done and what a solid national strategy looks like. And this is something that some of you might also be interested in as well, because national pollinator policies have been rolling out and being tweaked over the last 6 to 7 years, and it's hard to stay abreast of all that activity. But broadly speaking, there are as many types of strategies as there are strategies. Strategies from the likes of England, Scotland, and Ireland are generally looked at as good examples of comprehensive plans in terms of content, meaning they address many of the issues that are identified by scientists as causing pollinator declines. But just as crucially, they also contain important components of evidence-based plans. It bears in mind that the actual process of crafting a national plan with the important components that you would see in an evidence-based strategy, for example, an inventory of initiatives, of what's already happening in your borders, stakeholder inclusion, et cetera. This would likely be easier in a smaller country. Horizontal integration would also likely be a smoother process when working together to coordinate and implement actions to achieve the desired outcomes. These countries are also not as diverse in terms of agrisystems, and perhaps more importantly, the model of governance is highly centralized when compared to Canada. So we have smaller countries, fewer players, less diverse in certain aspects, and more centralization, all taken together, mean that these national plans might serve as good models for plans here on a subnational level. So we can turn our attention to the US, because while we have a fraction of the population, we have much in common in terms of having a similarly vast and diverse land base coupled with a decentralized governance model. So as most of you are familiar, the US adopted their national plan in 2015. The Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, encouraged states to develop managed pollinator protection plans, or MP3s. The EPA played a supportive role in overseeing the development and implementation of state plans, and also committed to monitoring their progress and effectiveness. The EPA didn't provide any funding for the development process. The state MP3s are voluntary, and there's no approval process to make sure that they contain critical elements. 45 out of the 50 states are developing plans. Just over 30 exist currently. Some are called MP3s and some have other names. About a third of them were adopted after 2015, so after the national plan came out, and they mirror the national orientation around honeybees and monarchs. Some do mention other wild pollinators, but they're generally not treated in much depth. In 2019, authors Caitlin Whitney and Brianna Singer looked at 30 or so state plans that were available at that point and evaluated them using 3 frameworks for evidence-based policymaking to see how they fared. The authors found that most states did not score highly consistently across the frameworks, and also that state plans varied a lot in terms of which aspects of pollinator health would be addressed and how. So if you're curious, Connecticut scored the lowest overall. Missouri's plan, mostly focused on monarchs, scored the highest. But of course, adoption of these plans, it doesn't tell the whole story in terms of action being taken to protect pollinators. And that goes for the US or any other country where there are no official plans. There is legislation that may be passed either standalone or bundled with other bills. And here you'll find Connecticut, whose pollinator plan was rated abysmally, according to the previous study, and would not be considered evidence-based under any of the 3 frameworks that the authors looked at. But they've passed relatively stronger legislation on pollinator protection when compared to other states. But as it turns out, the story on the legislation front is not hugely inspiring either. A recent study by Damon Hall and Rebecca Steiner analyzed US state-level pollinator-relevant policies, and they didn't mince words when they said that with few exceptions, states passed no-cost, politically feasible yet toothless policies, that they worked within existing budgets and harmed few, if any, industries. They were narrow in scope, as much of the policy content was related to tightening apiculture standards. Not sure how to pronounce that. All in all, they constitute nascent and anemic steps in addressing the pollinator health crisis. Policies also failed to address a few of the 10 policy areas that Lynn Dix and her pollinator biologist colleagues state as critical in order to safeguard the world's insect pollinators. US legislation, up to 2018 at least, has failed to address 3 of 10 policy targets, which are underlined here, and which includes promoting diversified farming systems, providing incentives for farmers to move away from agrochemicals, and addressing the sublethal effects of GM crops in risk assessments. Of the other recommendations, integrated pest management, or IPM, number 2 there, was only mentioned twice, and monitoring is only mentioned in 1 piece of legislation. Okay, so there's a lot to be desired in US plans and their policies when we're thinking about content on wild pollinator conservation other than monarchs. But we can definitely borrow conceptually the great idea of developing federal guidance and helping provinces and territories craft their subnational plans and learn from what has been somewhat of a botched execution at the US federal level. For example, an internal EPA audit found that ironically, in asking states to develop plans, the EPA overlooked developing a plan themselves on how they would analyze and measure state MP3s, despite surveying states on their plans late last year. So this makes it difficult to gauge how states' achievements are supporting national goals. Let's see. Sorry there, I was on the wrong slide. That probably didn't make sense. There we go, sorry about that. Okay. We also recommend an approval process to ensure plans contain both critical components and content. We should choose an evidence-based framework that we want provinces to adhere to and specify any non-negotiables within the components of that framework. So an example would be deep work with Indigenous communities within the component of stakeholder inclusion, commitments to funding, or within the component of place-based assessments and inventories of current initiatives, we may require that some national plans identify opportunities for biodiversity mainstreaming and integrate pollinator conservation into existing sector-specific plans or initiatives on climate or sustainable development. We want to keep in mind that we don't necessarily want to create parallel or artificial processes that waste resources and diminish the reach of conservation efforts. So in terms of content, making sure subnational plans address all relevant policy areas as laid out by Lynn Dix and her colleagues, require that content address multiple species or species at risk, or how provinces will contribute to national monitoring efforts. Perhaps initial approval of some subnational plans or meeting benchmarks along the way could serve as a lever for funding toward helping provinces achieve what they set out to do in their plans. I skipped the second one there. It's also important to have a clear vision of how some national plan activities will feed into meeting larger goals. Okay. So speaking of national goals, what should these goals be? And what actions can we take to achieve them? What are the knowledge gaps? And over the course of this project, we took a stab at answering these questions, working under the guidance of a scientific advisory committee of about 20 people with different areas of expertise, also geographically dispersed. We wanted to incorporate place-based differences and understandings of the landscape, natural, political, and cultural as it relates to pollinator conservation. Also, working within our capacity as a lab, our project has been mostly bee-centric, but we're making high-level recommendations, so most suggestions will help most pollinators. That said, if the documented recommendations we produce are taken up and amplified, it would be worked over and refined to more carefully consider other pollinators. We do include actions specifically for monarchs, and we will spotlight endangered pollinators other than bees within the document itself. All right, so this is how it's organized. At the top, we have an overall vision, which is to make Canada more native pollinator friendly. Oh, I have wild there, wild pollinator friendly. The vision is supported by 4 goals, which are protect wild pollinators from pesticides, protect wild pollinators from disease, provide resources that wild pollinators need to thrive, and building and sharing our knowledge. Each goal is supported by objectives, and then we have actions or solutions, as I will call them interchangeably throughout this talk, that feed into meeting those objectives. We also include knowledge gaps that would ideally need to be addressed in order to support those actions. And I will go into these in much more detail, the actions and the knowledge gaps. But I want to point out that we do call for a separate objective or some national integrated pest management plans to support objective 2 there, which is reducing the use or need for pesticides. And meeting goals under IPM plans can also be applied to meeting larger national goals around reducing pesticide use. The method we use to collect recommendations for actions and knowledge gaps is called a policy Delphi. Policy Delphi is characterized by a series of survey iterations, at least 2 rounds, with anonymous controlled feedback to an expert panel to synthesize informed judgments on a complex topic. Responses from each round are synthesized and returned to panelists for anonymous review and evaluation in subsequent rounds. In this case, we only did 2. Some of you may have participated in one before. I know Mark Brown et al. Published a horizon scan of future threats and opportunities for pollinators in 2016 that utilized a similar method. So the anonymity of the feedback is considered the main strength of this method. It allows the panelists to share their ideas without fear of judgment, and it can mitigate the influence of unequal power dynamics. This was inspired by a project I participated in as a panelist a couple years ago, and I learned a lot by participating in it and reading what others with different experiences came up with as solutions to the problem. So in a nutshell, we have panelists generating solutions in round 1, and in round 2, panelists rate their colleagues' suggestions in terms of not only whether they support them, but whether they think that they are feasible to implement. The objective was to find solutions that had a high consensus of support and also achieved a high consensus around feasibility of implementation. High consensus was considered to be 70% of responses falling into one category or 80% across 2 contiguous categories. For example, 80% of the ratings for a particular solution fell into either the strongly supported category, weakly supported category, or a combination of both. We were also curious if panelists were polarized on any solutions. Do some think that something is a great idea, while others might think it's a terrible idea? And although we did have panelists strongly opposing solutions, especially in the pesticides category, we didn't find much polarization at all. But I'd be curious if this study were applied to a broader group, including industry or farmers, for example, how this might shake out. Our expert panel consisted of 32 people, including committee members, and we generated initial solutions through an online survey. To bring your attention to the left-hand side of the screen there, this is how round one was set up. We asked the panel to list up to 3 policy solutions, program suggestions, and research priorities for each major stressor: pesticides, habitat loss, pathogens, non-native species, and climate change. And panelists could skip categories depending on their self-assessed expertise in that particular area. When analyzing the data for round one, policy and programming solutions were merged and coded together because there was not enough distinction between those in terms of responses. And on the topic of climate change, although there are plenty of suggestions regarding research priorities as they relate specifically to pollinators and climate, the policy and programming suggestions were very broad. So the solutions were not put out to the panel to rank in the second round. But since climate change will have such a large impact on native pollinators, we will include the most popular research priorities listed by panelists in the final project write-up. The synthesized solutions were sent back to the panel, and they were asked to rank their support for each solution on a 4-point scale, from strongly support to strongly oppose, as well as their opinion on the feasibility of the solution on a 4-point scale, from definitely feasible to definitely infeasible. Feasible is considered anything that might be affecting the likelihood of adoption. So it could be resource limitations, technological difficulties, political willpower, critical knowledge gaps, and other hurdles. Panelists were asked to provide qualitative justifications for their support and feasibility rankings for at least 3 of their choices per stressor category that they chose to answer. Our recommended actions were derived from solutions that reached a high level of consensus for strong support, combined with high optimism for the feasibility of implementing those solutions. We grouped those actions into larger themes, which we labeled objectives, and then we selected research priorities that supported those objectives and labeled those knowledge gaps. Also note on the non-native species stressor category, panelists put forward solutions addressing either invasive plants, which were duplicated in solutions for the habitat loss category, or referred to non-native bees, which were either mentioned in the habitat loss category in the context of resource competition and altering native ecosystems, or in the pathogen category in the context of spreading diseases outside the region in which they're native. So high-ranking solutions in the non-native species category were able to be considered in other categories. This is a sample of the comments panelists provided to justify their support rankings in the pesticides category, and gives you an idea of the context that was created through the Delphi when panelists were evaluating their choices. These comments pertain to support for a pesticide tax, access to biocontrol agents, and labeling produce with pesticides used. The suggestion of a pesticide tax reached a high level of consensus of support, but it was not considered feasible to implement. A panelist response reads, "I don't think this is how we get buy-in from producers, makes them feel like the bad guy. Most growers are already running on slim margins, which will eventually lead to higher food costs for consumers, pushing people who are already food insecure into further stress." And the solutions below are not ranked as desirable, so their feasibility becomes irrelevant. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the context that was created. All right, so before going through the results on pesticides, I want to point out I've included tentative progress measures and also leads on some of these actions. It might not really be appropriate at this stage, but I thought that they would generate maybe some musings on your end, and we could brainstorm about some of this later. There are also actions highlighted in green, and they were added based on a deeper dive into some of the literature and other resources pertaining to the actions that were already recommended. So the first objective is improving how we assess risk to pollinators. Panelists overwhelmingly responded that currently the complete reliance on the managed honeybee as a sole model species to represent all insect pollinators within pesticide risk assessments appears insufficiently protective. The group emphasized the need to expand the scope to consistently incorporate multiple pollinating species and increase the sophistication of the PMRA's risk assessments for pesticides pending approval. A measure of progress supporting this objective would be creating an avenue to the research community to be able to disseminate the results directly up to Health Canada. Also, the PMRA is working with international partners and has collaborated with scientists, even some of the panelists, on the current state of science on pesticide exposure to non-apis bees and the appropriateness of using the honeybee as a surrogate. But we definitely need more transparency and updates regarding how this information is being applied to improve assessments. In terms of pesticide use in Canada, there's no coordinated national collection of data on their use. Panelists suggested open data on field applications or a cyclical survey. Field application data would be the dream. I would say it would be the dream, and it would be a dream for many reasons, but because I doubt its feasibility. But a possibility might be extrapolated usage using representative samples or farms for particular crops or in particular areas. Civil servants at the PMRA mentioned that they just updated their pesticide program model after a 2-year project. And this includes the provision to ensure that the PMRA has information that they need to conduct assessments such as water monitoring data, real world information on how pesticides are used in Canada, and to monitor the usage of pesticides following their registration. So this is a development to keep a close eye on. And again, HERO will make a case for transparency and how the program model will be improved using this data in the coming years. Most of the research priorities identified in the Delphi for the pesticides category address this first objective here, and largely underpin and complement the recommended policy work as it relates to the PMRA. So panelists recommended that more research was needed to determine modeling parameters related to the exposure of wild pollinators to pesticides other than through nectar and pollen, realistic chemical cocktails that wild pollinators are exposed to in the field, and over time, including chemicals from tank mixes, as well as how to consider sublethal effects. Toxicity values for ground-dwelling pollinators is also needed. So moving on to objective 2, reducing the need for pesticides. And the panelists strongly believe that we should bring extension back. So for a variety of reasons, Canadian agricultural extension has morphed considerably over the last decades into a shadow of what it once was. Though it varies provincially, an extension agent functions now more like a peer information consultant, helping the farmer to access information rather than being seen as the main source of expertise. So what kind of extension do we need? And we have options to consider here. Targeted extension focused on biodiversity-centered practices can be moderately successful, though this might not be a sustainable service model. In the future, I think will look more like how multiple practices can be combined to provide stacked benefits to growers. And examples would be enhancing soil health, pollination services, pest reduction, and carbon sequestration, just to give a couple examples. The nature of expertise would ideally evolve as well. The value added would be providing growers with support that they can't get from peer consultation or the internet. A challenge is that maximizing ecosystem services depends on a highly personalized model. So you can have practices that act synergistically or antagonistically, and trade-offs often need to be decided right down to the farm level. The evolution of soil carbon credits and demonstrating the economic value of wild pollinators are examples of monetizing ecosystem services that can help with evaluating the trade-offs, and also could potentially justify more expensive extension programs if growers can improve yield while also achieving long-term reduction in inputs like fertilizer, fossil fuels, pesticides, and managed pollinators, which is also an input. In the meantime, the bare minimum we need in extension is an integration of messaging regarding wild pollinators and discussing the benefit of interventions that are already taking place under the auspices of current programming. An approach of note is that Ireland has funded a farmland project officer who's dedicated solely to working on achieving select objectives of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which is pretty cool. So going hand in hand with extension is a strong support and optimism for implementing a national integrated pest management program. Currently, the federal government is involved in research, tech transfer, and programs that partially fund IPM actions on individual farms. But it's at the national level where we also need to start thinking about moving beyond just supporting IPM implementation cost shares and thinking about designing incentive-based policies like creating market segments for IPM products. Also, much like a national pollinator strategy, a national IPM program would support the development of subnational IPM plans, much like they've done in Europe, with the European Union guiding member states to develop action plans with targets, measures, and timetables. Developing subnational IPM plans comes with unique challenges because IPM support and implementation varies so much between provinces here in Canada. Ontario is the only Canadian province that has made IPM training a regulatory requirement for those who want to access neonic treated corn and soy seeds. Implementation also varies a lot between industries. Guidelines are highly variable in their stage of development and level of adoption. For example, we have a high level of IPM practices implemented in orchards and greenhouses, and IPM guidelines are fairly advanced there, but this is not so much the case with other crops. So since the EU has 8 or so years of experience in this area, we can definitely learn from their hiccups in evaluating highly heterogeneous national plans or from member states and the steps that they've taken recently to harmonize risk indicators, address member plan weaknesses, and creating platforms to share best practices. As an overarching framework, there are many that say that the current concept of IPM needs a makeover as it's become less of a holistic approach and is more about a spectrum of practices that are often superimposed on each other without carefully considering the long-term effects on the agro-system overall or in the long term. There are other better conceptual frameworks out there, which I think might be called for if Canada were to adopt the solution of developing a national program. We should also keep in mind that IPM's national plans need to include industries like golf courses, the sod industry, and others, because though ag is a relatively heavy user of pesticides, in the absence of a total ban on cosmetic pesticides, other industries will definitely contribute. Panelists would also like to see an increase to access to untreated seeds. And this can be especially needed in places like Saskatchewan or Alberta, where growers might not know what's on their seeds. And neonic treated canola, for example, is near ubiquitous with no red tape, as far as I understand. Please, if someone knows more about this, fill me in. Larger seed companies may not make untreated seed corn, for example, or if they do, they might offer just a limited selection of hybrids. And they also might be, you have to request them months in advance. In terms of addressing knowledge gaps in support of the second objective, we have the need for more research supporting farming with IPM principles, which is that first circle there. Also, developing and improving thresholds at which certain pesticides are justified for growers was also mentioned. For many pests, there are no thresholds, no prediction models currently. Although I may add that this is certainly needed, but other approaches may be considered and potentially more successful, such as basing access on individual field history, such as done in Quebec currently for neonics. Finding alternatives was also a research priority under this objective. Panelists stressed that we need not just more of the same in terms of switching to a new substance that in 5 or 10 years' time will be discovered to be just as damaging to ecosystems, but using newer technologies like RNA interference that is targeted and will only kill flea beetles in a canola field, for example. We need to look into those sorts of options. Okay, objective 3. The restriction of pesticides. These solutions are all related to the application of pesticides for cosmetic purposes. We're going to see most of this conversation play out at the subnational level between the provinces. They have the authority over the sale and use of pesticides, and the municipalities that can't restrict sales, but they're allowed to pass bylaws regarding how registered pesticides are used within their jurisdiction. Currently, we have upwards of about 200 Canadian municipalities that have passed pesticide use restrictions. As many of you know, many provinces have already passed cosmetic pesticide bans, but they're not uniform in design and make exceptions for various uses and industries such as cemeteries, golf courses, and nurseries. The way the exceptions to the ban play out can get confusing, potentially affecting the overall effectiveness of the ban. So for example, you may be able to purchase pesticides off the shelf that may be only approved for use to control poisonous plants, but it's up to the consumer to use that in a way that, in the way that it's supposed to be used. So on the honor system, essentially. Without a uniform ban, it's possible to obtain products that are not on the allowable list across provincial or international borders. So panelists recommend cosmetic bans in provinces that don't have them, coordinating approaches between provinces, and reducing exceptions in terms of sales for exceptions, and for exceptions for things like public health and safety or to control invasive weeds. There might be other ways to ensure that these products are only used in the ways that they are intended without introducing red tape and extra costs. And perhaps some of you have put some thought into this or have some ideas, and it would be great to hear about some suggestions on that front. Okay, so moving out of pesticides and into disease. The first objective of two serving this goal of protecting wild pollinators from disease is reducing pathogens in managed pollinators in order to curb disease spread to wild ones. Monarchs and commercial bees, other than honeybees, are either reared within Canada or imported, sometimes directly to an end user through the mail without any required screening. Biosecurity standards do exist for the most commonly used managed bees and serve as guidance for producers and end users. But it's ultimately up to the company to ensure that their pollinators are not diseased. And likewise, it's up to the consumer to make sure that bees are managed well, to seek advice and report sick bees, obtain permits from the province if bees are to travel, and to ensure that they are disposed of properly. In the case of the commercial bumblebee industry, there's a low level of transparency regarding where bees are being shipped and what kind of screening they underwent prior to leaving the facilities. There's currently no way to track commercial bumblebees, and if a new disease outbreak occurs, there's no chain of accountability or way to trace their physical path to study the impact. So first off, panelists recommend the action of establishing a clean stock program that tracks third-party certified pathogen-free bumblebees. And the good news on this front is that Dr. Colla's lab has received funding from Environment Canada to develop a model for this very thing. It will be scoped out in terms of organizational structure, key players, and a review of comparable certification programs and other tasks that will be performed. Second would be the requirement of independent lab testing at commercial bumblebee production centers. If this were to be regulated, it would likely be so under the Provincial Bee Acts. And lastly, ensuring commercial monarch breeders follow protocols aimed at disease prevention. And this was a recommendation that didn't come out of the survey, but was pulled from work that we did for Environment Canada on the state of knowledge of pathogens affecting at-risk pollinators last year. Companies are currently able to ship stocks across Canada for events with no oversight, and in the absence of banning this practice, ideally requirements for routine screening would be in place. Knowledge gaps supporting this objective would be improving or developing pathogen screening techniques and knowing more about how we might treat managed pollinators other than honeybees for pathogens. In objective 2, we have limit impacts of pathogen transmission between managed and wild pollinators. And this would be accomplished mainly by reducing or eliminating contact between managed bees and wild ones, and by preventing them from foraging on the same resources. One of the ways the panelists think that this can be realized is by keeping managed bees out of or at a reasonable distance from protected or public land. These steps also serve to protect plant-pollinator relationships in native ecosystems and reduce resource competition between managed and wild populations. Also supported and thought to be feasible was the mandatory use of queen excluders. This recommendation is made in the Bumblebee Biosecurity Standard, but we would recommend that it's passed into law. And this is especially important where a pollinator is being used out of its natural range. and non-native to the region through which they're traveling or being used, such as the case of Bombus impatiens or the common eastern bumblebee used heavily for pollination in greenhouses, greenhouse crops in the prairies. And lastly, we have equipping greenhouses with technology to prevent escapes. This is largely in place, but there have been documented escapes, and equipping greenhouses is also included in the biosecurity standard, but again, it's not law. There were a lot of panelists identified knowledge gaps here, and filling these would tell us more about how to reduce the risk of pathogen spillover and spillback between managed and wild pollinators. Some of these, such as the last one, the role of nutrition and gut biota and immunity, could serve both objectives of limiting impact of pathogens transmitted and also reducing pathogens and managed pollinators in the first place. Others include building our basic knowledge, for example, understanding more about the background levels of disease in wild populations, and more obviously applied research efforts like determining the role of floral resources in mitigating or contributing to pathogen spread. Goal 3 is about eliminating habitat loss for wild pollinators, or framed in the positive, providing resources that pollinators need to thrive. And 2 themes emerged from panelist rankings in round 2. The first is the obvious move of combating habitat loss by creating more of it. And meeting this objective requires the involvement of many parties outside of the government: land trusts, conservation organizations, industry, landowners, etc. And many of these partnerships already exist. So our task is to mobilize the knowledge of these networks and also to figure out how to count their achievements toward the fulfillment of measurable targets for habitat creation on the national level. Panelist solutions included creating habitat along corridors, connecting existing habitat, and focusing on identifying and protecting pollinator hotspots. And lastly, panelists thought it was important to channel support into particular sectors of civil society, for example, providing financial support for habitat creation in less affluent areas to help build capacity, and targeting urban populations through wildscaping programs. So in terms of knowledge gaps, a clear picture emerged from the 45 panel identified research priorities. We need urgent work on the ecology and biology of wild bees as it relates to habitat, especially nesting requirements. Panelists stress that we don't have the data we need to make informed decisions about what type of habitat to create or prioritize for conservation, where it should be, and how much we need. There were also research priorities that would suggest perhaps a less meticulous approach might be warranted, mentioning the need to find enhancements that are easy, low cost, with maybe less diverse seed mixes, but a high likelihood of adoption, starting by targeting places that are most depleted in terms of floral resources. And this would be reminiscent of the U.S. National Plan goals, which were designed to overlap, creating synergies to support multiple pollinator taxa. Also, a priority was research on how to motivate people to create habitat for pollinators. The second theme, or objective 2, is working towards supporting the ecological integrity of habitat for wild pollinators. Solutions include supporting the development of native seed stock, supporting native nurseries at producers, and eliminating invasive plants in available pollinator mixes. Highly supported and considered feasible also included adopting bylaws that reduce mowing, clearly falling under municipal lead there, and incentivizing the maintenance of natural or semi-natural habitat on farmland. Supporting this objective would be determining benefits of changing mowing practices, how to better design seed mixes, and linking the presence of semi-natural habitat to crop yield. And this would be a challenge, but may go a long way in convincing farmers to work with organizations like ALICE, the Alternative Land Use Services, to leave marginal land in its natural state or create habitat to the extent that they don't sacrifice prime farmland. The last goal is increasing and sharing our knowledge, for which we're still developing specific recommendations. And this wasn't a topic that was specifically addressed in the Delphi, so it'd be great to have a conversation about this topic here on this discussion platform. That would be great. We have 2 tentative objectives. First, a theme that ran through responses pertaining to all the stressors was the urgent need for coordinated monitoring efforts and many more of them. Dr. Victoria McPhail, a contributor to this project, was going to fill us in on this topic. This is her area of expertise, but she's not able to present today, but I do see that she's here. She might still be here and have a few words to say about it. So I'll leave that up to her. But one initiative that I did want to mention that you are probably either following or involved in is the U.S. National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network. That's a mouthful. It's funded by the USDA, and they're aiming to coordinate methods and data sets to provide a baseline for changes over space and time. Over the next 2 years, bee biologists will develop a national plan for native bee monitoring that includes monitoring protocols, designating priority areas for monitoring, and educational and training opportunities in areas that are fundamental to native bee monitoring. And this initiative should be followed closely to see how we can plug in and learn from its rollout. The second tentative objective is elaborating on the federal role in engaging the public and helping wild pollinators. And using Ireland as a role model here, this could include providing succinct but engaging branded guidance materials that are geared towards sectors and communities. We can provide education on the plan and provide ways that they can help. So for example, Ireland has materials geared toward golf courses, faith communities, gardens, transport corridors, wind farms, etc. And they're all branded, and they provide a really unified presentation that's really accessible. So before I wrap up, before I wrap up and talk about next steps, I do want to mention climate change. I wanted to present the panelist research priorities. Let's see. So over on the left here, we have how climate change affects overwintering habitat. Also, panelists urged research on how resilience varies between groups and also the limits to adaptation. And research on phenological mismatches was also prioritized, particularly for early spring emerging bee species, as was work on plant pollinator networks in general. And also of note was finding ways to mitigate climate change related stress on pollinators and the potential for humans to help them adapt. Assisted migration was mentioned as a possibility. All right, so next steps. We need to finish writing up the project. So individual sections of this will go out to advisory committee members for comments and review shortly. We hope to have our work amplified by the Green Budget Coalition as they table their 2022 recommendations to the federal government. If I've done my math right, they have recommended federal funding of $17 million a year to establish a Canadian Native Pollinator Roundtable, to create a national action plan, to support national monitoring, and to develop a native pollinator protection program that provides increased operational capacity to address key threats. Also through Environment Canada, we hope to integrate our work into the first North American pollinator conservation framework as part of CEC's enormous effort to compile a state of knowledge on native pollinators between 3 countries. One of the aspects that's really interesting in the work that they're doing is they're compiling information on socioeconomic and ecological benefits of native pollinators, and also, featuring case studies and other data. And I think this will be crucial info to bolster support for the adoption of a Canadian national strategy in the future, hopefully in the very near future. Okay, so thank you so much for your kind attention. And I was worried I would go 60 minutes, but here we are. I hope I didn't rush through it, but we have lots of time to discuss. I know this was a lot of information to synthesize on many topics. So if any of you know some new things already happening that pertain to some of these recommendations, please do share.